2 weeks ago, I sent a message to someone I'm close to. It was about a decision I was processing, something connected to the Saturn-Neptune conjunction that had landed a few days earlier. At the time, the message felt precise, clear, well articulated. I reread it this morning, and it reads like a different person wrote it. Not wrong exactly, but incomplete in a way I could not have seen at the time. The words I chose assumed things I no longer assume. The framing centered something that is no longer central, and the confidence in the tone feels almost naive from where I sit now, 8 days into the retrograde and 2 days past the eclipse. That gap between what I wrote on February 23rd and what I understand on March 5th is the retrograde's work. Not disruption, revision. The retrograde took the message I thought was clear and showed me all the places it was not. All the assumptions I was encoding without awareness. All the borrowed certainty that was doing the talking instead of the actual knowing underneath. I want to use that personal experience as the entry point for today because I think it illustrates something about Mercury retrograde in Pisces that gets lost in generic retrograde content. This is not a transit about technology failing and emails going missing and exes texting. Those surface-level manifestations happen, but the mechanism underneath, particularly in Pisces, is much more interesting and much more useful than don't sign contracts for 3 weeks. Mercury retrograde in Pisces revises the relationship between what you know and how you express what you know. It reveals the distance between your internal understanding and your external articulation of that understanding. And at the midpoint, 8 days in, that distance is at its most visible. You can feel the gap. The thing you know clearly, but cannot say clearly. The insight that is real, but resists translation into language. That gap is not a malfunction. It is the revision in progress. I first covered this retrograde on February 24th, the day before Mercury stationed. I described it as operating inside the Saturn-Neptune conjunction field, a communication scrambler walking backward through a construction site. At the time, that framing was accurate but incomplete in a way I could not have known. What I did not anticipate was the eclipse. The lunar eclipse on March 3rd fundamentally changed the material Mercury retrograde is working with. Before the eclipse, the retrograde was revising the communication of the conjunction clarity, how you expressed what landed on February 20th. After the eclipse, the retrograde is revising something deeper, not just how you express what you know itself. The eclipse removed borrowed light. It showed you the actual surface of things. And now the retrograde is taking that eclipse-revealed material and asking, have you actually integrated this? Or are you still running on the pre-eclipse version of your understanding? The revision has deepened. The midpoint feels heavier than the beginning, and that is because the material being revised got more real when the eclipse stripped it bare. Let me describe the midpoint pattern because it applies to every Mercury retrograde, not just this one. Retrogrades operate in 2 phases. The first phase, from station to midpoint, is the dismantling phase. Mercury moves backward through territory it recently covered and destabilizes what seemed settled. Communications that felt clear become ambiguous. Decisions that felt final reopen. Systems that were running smoothly develop glitches. The first phase feels like things are falling apart. The midpoint, which is roughly where we are now, is the turning point. Not externally, internally. The midpoint is where you stop resisting the revision and start understanding what is being revised. The first week, you fight the retrograde. You try to communicate anyway. You push through the scrambled channel. You insist on clarity when clarity is not available. Around day 8, you stop fighting. Not because you give up, because you finally see what the retrograde is working on. The revision becomes visible. And the second phase, from midpoint to station direct, is the integration phase. You take what the first phase dismantled and what the midpoint revealed, and you begin rebuilding with more accurate material. The second half of a retrograde is not the continuation of chaos. It is the slow return of functional communication built on revised understanding. 3 areas of life that this particular Pisces retrograde is revising, and I am drawing these from the tracking group data and my own observation. Area 1. How you describe your emotional reality to others and to yourself. Pisces governs the felt sense, the nonverbal, the intuitive. Mercury retrograde in Pisces is revising the stories you tell about your feelings. Not the feelings themselves, the narration. Several people in the tracking group have reported realizing this week that the way they describe their emotional state to friends, partners, or therapists does not actually match the emotion. They have been using language that was approximately right, but not precisely right. And the distance between approximately and precisely turns out to matter enormously. The retrograde is narrowing that distance, forcing more precise emotional language, which feels uncomfortable because precise emotional language is vulnerable in a way that approximate language is not. Area 2. Creative and spiritual communication. How you express the non-rational parts of your inner life. If you have a creative practice, the retrograde is probably revising your relationship to it, not blocking it, restructuring how the creative impulse translates into form. Several people in my circle who write, paint, or make music have reported that their usual process has stopped working, but something else is emerging, a different entry point. A different relationship between the internal vision and the external expression. One musician told me they sat down to write in their usual way and nothing came. But when they stopped trying to write and just played without direction, something arrived that they described as more honest than anything I have written in 2 years. The retrograde did not remove the creativity. It removed the habitual route between the creativity and the output. And when the habitual route was blocked, a more direct route became visible. Stay with me on this because it applies beyond creative practice. The retrograde is asking everyone, not just artists, to find more honest routes between inner experience and outer expression. The old shortcuts between feeling and form are being exposed as shortcuts, and the retrograde is asking for the longer, more accurate path. Area 3. The communication of what the eclipse revealed. This is the most immediate and the most practically important. The eclipse showed you something 2 days ago, something real, something that survived when the borrowed light went out. And right now, you are sitting with an eclipse insight that you cannot cleanly articulate. Every time you try to tell someone what shifted, the words fall short. The email sounds wrong. The conversation does not land. I experienced this myself yesterday. I tried to describe what the eclipse had shown me about a relationship in my life, and I watched the other person's face go confused. Not because they disagreed, because my words were not carrying the actual insight. They were carrying an approximation of the insight, and the approximation was close enough to be recognizable, but far enough to be misleading. That is Mercury retrograde, revising the communication of eclipse material in real time. The insight is real. The language for it is not yet available. The retrograde is building that language. It is testing different framings, different angles of approach, different entry points for the truth the eclipse delivered. By the time Mercury stations direct on March 20th, you will be able to say clearly what you know. Right now, you are in the revision process that makes that future clarity possible. And the gap between knowing and speaking is where the retrograde lives. I want to explain why Mercury retrograde in Pisces feels different from retrograde in other signs, because the distinction matters for navigation. Mercury retrograde in an air sign like Gemini or Aquarius tends to be sharp. Logical errors, factual miscommunications, wrong dates, wrong numbers, wrong details. You can identify the problem and fix the specific error. Mercury retrograde in an earth sign like Virgo or Capricorn tends to be practical. Systems malfunction, logistics scramble. The fix is mechanical. Adjust the system, replace the part, redo the schedule. Mercury retrograde in a fire sign like Aries or Leo tends to be about ego and identity. You say something you regret because the impulse outran the filter. The fix is an apology and a recalibration. Mercury retrograde in a water sign, and Pisces is the deepest water sign, does not produce identifiable errors. It produces a pervasive sense that language itself is insufficient. The problem is not that you said the wrong thing. The problem is that the right thing cannot be said with the tools currently available. The feeling during Pisces retrograde is not, I made a mistake in communication, but communication itself is failing to capture what I need to express. That feeling is frustrating. It is also accurate. And the accuracy is the gift. Because the retrograde is teaching you that the communication tools you were using before were not precise enough for the material you are now carrying. The eclipse handed you something that requires a new vocabulary. The retrograde is building that vocabulary. And the building process feels like failure until it does not. I have a practice during Pisces retrogrades that helps, and I want to share it because it has been useful for me across 3 Pisces retrograde cycles. Instead of trying harder to say things precisely, I give myself permission to say them imprecisely. I tell the other person directly, I know what I mean, but the words are not landing right. Bear with me while I circle it. And then I circle. I approach the insight from multiple angles. I use 3 different descriptions of the same thing. I contradict myself and then correct the contradiction. The circling is the process. The precision emerges not from a single attempt at the right words, but from the triangulation of multiple imperfect attempts. By the 3rd or 4th pass, the thing I am trying to say has been outlined from enough angles that the shape becomes visible, even though no single description captured it perfectly. I want to preview the Cazimi briefly because it arrives in 2 days, and it matters. On March 7th, the Sun and Mercury conjunct at the same degree in Pisces. This event is called a Cazimi. Mercury in the heart of the Sun. In traditional astrology, the Cazimi is the moment when a retrograde planet is briefly purified and strengthened by its proximity to the Sun. In practical terms, it means 24 hours of unusual clarity inside the retrograde fog. The scrambled channel briefly unscrambles. The thing you have been unable to articulate becomes temporarily speakable. If there is one conversation you need to have during this retrograde, one message you need to send, one piece of eclipse material you need to communicate, the Cazimi window on March 7th is the time. Not before, not after. That specific 24-hour period when the Sun lends Mercury its light and the retrograde pauses its revision long enough for a clear transmission. I will do a full video on the Cazimi on Saturday. For now, mark the date. March 7th. The eye of the retrograde storm. The second half of this retrograde, from today through March 20th, has a different texture than the first half. The dismantling is largely complete. What needed to be destabilized has been destabilized. The eclipse added its layer. The midpoint has arrived. From here, the retrograde shifts from revealing what was wrong with your communication to showing you what right communication looks like for the post-eclipse material you are carrying. You will notice language becoming available that was not available last week. Framings that feel more accurate. Descriptions of your situation that actually match the situation instead of approximating it. This process is gradual, not a switch. A slow focusing of a lens that has been deliberately blurred for 8 days. By March 15th, you will be communicating with noticeably more precision than you were on February 25th. And by March 20th, when Mercury stations direct, the new vocabulary will be functional. Not perfect, functional. And functional is enough to build on. I want to give you a practical exercise for the second half. Go back to something you wrote or said around February 25th or 26th. A message, a journal entry, a voice memo. Something you expressed during the first days of the retrograde. Read it with the eyes you have now. Notice where the words feel inaccurate, where the framing was off, where the confidence was borrowed rather than earned. That gap between how you expressed yourself then and how you would express it now is the measure of the retrograde's revision work. It is not a gap to feel bad about. It is evidence of growth in real time. The person who wrote that message was operating with pre-eclipse understanding and less precise tools. The person reading it now has been through an eclipse, through 8 days of communication revision, and has started building a more accurate vocabulary. That is progress. Uncomfortable progress, but progress. Here's where it lands. The revision that matters most during this retrograde is not about technology or logistics or other people's messages. It is about the relationship between your inner knowing and your ability to give that knowing a voice. The eclipse gave you truth. The retrograde is teaching you how to speak it. And the teaching takes time. More time than you want. More time than feels necessary. But the precision that emerges on the other side is worth every day of the process. I have watched this across multiple Pisces retrogrades, and the pattern is consistent. The people who resist the revision, who insist on speaking before the language is ready, produce miscommunication that takes months to untangle. The people who trust the process, who let the revision complete, who sit with the gap between knowing and speaking, emerge on the other side of March 20th with a clarity of expression that was not possible before the retrograde began. The frustration of the middle is the price of the precision that follows. That is the retrograde at its midpoint, halfway through the revision. The Cazimi arrives in 2 days with 24 hours of clarity. Use it wisely. And now you know what is being revised.